All right. Buckle up, everybody. We're going deep today. Like, seriously deep. We're diving into this section of the Bible, 1 Corinthians 14.
Yeah, fascinating stuff.
It's all about spiritual gifts.
Yeah.
Prophecy, speaking in tongues, that kind of thing. We're going to figure out what it all meant back then, in the early church.
Right.
And maybe uncover some surprises about, communication, community, all that good stuff.
It's interesting, right away you see this tension between two gifts.
Okay.
Prophecy and speaking in tongues.
Yeah, they were both pretty important to the early church, right?
Definitely. But this text we're looking at, it seems to put prophecy first.
Okay. Why is that? I mean, speaking in tongues always seems so, I don't know, mysterious, right?
It is. But the text, it gives us pretty clear reasons, and it comes down to this. Prophecy, it's about building up the community.
Okay, yeah.
Think about it. Has anyone ever said just the right thing to you?
Yeah.
At just the right time? Words that lift you up or maybe give you a new way to look at things?
I see what you're saying.
That's prophecy, how it's described here. Strengthening, encouraging, offering comfort, consolation to people.
So this whole idea of building up the community, it's kind of all over the place in this text, huh?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's this, really powerful line, verse 5. It says, "The one who prophesies is greater than the one who speaks in tongues, unless he interprets so that the church may be strengthened." So even if someone can speak in tongues, has that amazing ability,
right,
it's only valuable if people can understand it and if it helps the whole community.
Yeah, that makes sense. So prophecy is like, I don't know, a public service announcement for the soul, like meant to be shared, understood by everybody there.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
But speaking in tongues, that's still a bit of a mystery, isn't it?
It is. As it's described in this text, it's like a spiritual language, directed towards God. It's personal, not meant to be easily understood by others, at least not without interpretation.
So how do they explain speaking in tongues so people can, grasp it?
Well, they use this analogy with musical instruments.
Okay.
Really clever, actually. Verse 7 says, "Unless they make a distinction in the notes, how can what is played on the flute or harp be understood?" It's like you can't understand music without a clear melody, right?
Mm-hmm.
So speaking in tongues, it needs interpretation to have any real meaning for the community.
That's a great analogy. It's like even the most beautiful song, if it's just noise to you, it's meaningless. You need somebody to translate the music.
Yeah.
Into a language you can understand.
Yeah, exactly. That interpretation, it's like a bridge between the speaker's experience and the community understanding it. Without it, the message might stay locked away.
This text gets even more interesting, though, because it shares the author's own experience with speaking in tongues. He even says, verse 18, "I thank God that I speak in tongues more than all of you." But then there's this twist.
Yeah, he does. Acknowledges speaking in tongues is significant to him personally. But then he goes on to say how important it is to pray with your spirit and your mind.
Wait, with both?
Yeah.
How does that even, isn't that a little contradictory?
It might seem that way at first, but think about it. You're experiencing something deeply moving, right? Could be a painting or music, even just an incredible view. You feel it emotionally, but you also want to understand it intellectually.
I get it.
Make sense of it.
I get it.
It's the same with prayer. You engage your whole self, emotions, your spirit, your intellect.
So it's not about picking one over the other. It's finding that balance between the two.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. The author himself says, verse 15, "What should I do? I will pray with my spirit, but I will also pray with my mind." He's saying to take a, holistic approach to prayer? Emotional and intellectual, both fully engaged.
It's about being intentional, isn't it?
Yeah.
You're actively participating.
Yeah.
Not just getting swept away by emotion, but thinking critically too. Being present, but on multiple levels.
You got it. And that idea, it goes beyond religion,
Right.
How we communicate every day. We say things that mean a lot to us, but they can fall flat. If the other person doesn't understand, doesn't have the same context, it's about being mindful of how we express ourselves, making sure our message gets through.
This is making me think about how I talk to people. Not just what I'm saying, but how they're hearing it. But this text, it goes beyond individual experience, right? It talks about how this stuff, prophecy, tongues, how it plays out in a community. There's a real emphasis on order, purpose, right?
Absolutely. The author gives specific guidelines for how these gifts should be used within the community, especially during worship.
So it's not just like a free-for-all of spiritual expression, like what kind of guidelines?
Well, for example, there's a limit on how many people can speak in tongues at once. And every instance requires interpretation.
So everyone knows what's going on.
Exactly. The message isn't lost. It also talks about how prophets have this role in evaluating what's being said, making sure it aligns with the community's beliefs.
So it's about balancing individual expression and communal harmony.
Yeah.
Using these gifts to strengthen the whole church.
Exactly. Finding that sweet spot where everyone participates and benefits. And it's interesting because this whole tension, individual experience, community understanding, it leads us to another idea from the text. This idea that tongues can be a sign for unbelievers, while prophecy is for believers.
Oh, that's going to be a good one. We'll definitely get into that more after the break.
Oh, we will. We'll look at what that means, how it might challenge us to think about the different ways we communicate with those inside our beliefs and outside.
All right, listeners, stay tuned. Things are going to get even more interesting as we go deeper into this world of prophecy, speaking in tongues, all those spiritual gifts and their complexities. So before we got sidetracked, we were talking about this idea that tongues are a sign for unbelievers, while prophecy is meant for believers. What does that even mean?
It's one of those things that, well, it can be interpreted in so many ways, right? And that's what makes it so interesting. Maybe tongues, because they're harder to understand, maybe they're actually more intriguing to someone who's not familiar with the faith. Like, they see it as evidence of something, I don't know, beyond normal human experience, a glimpse into something spiritual. And that could make them curious, lead them to ask questions.
So it's kind of like a hook, a way to get their attention and start talking about faith. But
Yeah.
Is that a little, I don't know, manipulative, using something mysterious to lure people in?
Yeah, that's a good point. It does make you wonder about, being genuine versus putting on a show. But maybe it's not about manipulating, but more about, meeting people where they are. Someone who's never seen this kind of spiritual expression. It could be their first step toward exploring faith. Prophecy, on the other hand, it's focused on those who already believe. It assumes you already have that shared understanding.
That makes sense. You wouldn't start explaining complex theology to someone who's, just beginning to think about spirituality. You'd start with something that gets their attention, makes them want to learn more. It's like learning anything new, right? You need the basics first.
Exactly. Good communication, it means tailoring your message. And this passage from Corinthians, it seems to get that, even in a spiritual context.
Yeah.
Different approaches for different people.
So being mindful of your audience, not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. But, there's that big thing we haven't talked about yet.
Yeah.
That passage that's caused a lot of debate. The one about women staying silent in churches. Verse 34 says, "The women should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak. Rather, let them be in submission, as in fact the law says." How do we even begin to understand that today?
Yeah, that's where understanding the history and the culture is so important. This was written in a totally different time. Social norms were way different than what we're used to.
It's easy to read that today and feel, shocked, even offended. But we're reading it with our 21st century minds, right? So how do we make sense of this passage with what we know about, gender roles and equality?
It takes a lot of careful thought. Throughout history, people have interpreted it in different ways. Even different Christian groups see it differently.
Oh, okay.
Some take it literally. Others say it's more about the culture back then, not a rule for all time.
So there's not one clear answer everyone agrees on.
Not really, no. It's a passage that people are still debating today. Some scholars, they say the original Greek might be talking about a specific situation or a group of women, not a universal rule. Others think it's more about keeping things orderly during worship, not silencing women completely.
So if we're reading this today, how should we approach it?
I think it's an invitation to think critically, have real conversations when we're reading these ancient texts, to remember that the context is key. Understanding the history, the culture, it can help make sense of things that, seem confusing to us now,
Right.
or even offensive.
It also reminds us to be aware of our own biases when we're interpreting these texts, especially those from such a different time. Our own experiences shape how we understand what we're reading.
Absolutely. We have to respect the text, but also recognize that, while our understanding might change over time as we learn and grow, we should also, change how we engage with these texts.
So the takeaway here is that these challenging passages, they can actually help us grow. They can help us understand the text better and, help us figure out complex issues in our own lives.
Exactly. It's not about ignoring tough questions. It's about using them to learn and reflect. These conversations, they can help us understand our own beliefs and values better.
So we've covered a lot this whole idea of prophecy, speaking in tongues, that challenging passage about women. It's amazing how much depth there is to uncover, even in just this little section of text.
And what I find so fascinating is that, well, this ancient text is still relevant. We're still trying to figure out these spiritual gifts, how to communicate, how different voices fit into our communities.
These questions, they have real staying power. This search for meaning, for understanding. And speaking of exploring further, we can't finish a deep dive without giving our listeners something to think about. All right, so here's something to think about. Imagine you're, just going about your day, and you see someone speaking in tongues, like right in front of you. What would you do?
Yeah, that would get a reaction from people, wouldn't it? Some might be curious, others, well, they might be skeptical.
Right. Or maybe even a little, freaked out.
If possible.
So would you try to understand what they were saying? Or would you just, watch and let them have their experience?
That's a great question. I mean, there's no right answer, is there?
Right. Yeah.
It really makes you think about your own beliefs.
Exactly. Like, how do you approach things you don't understand? Things that might challenge how you see the world.
Because these ideas, they aren't just something from, a long time ago.
Right.
We're still dealing with them today. It's about wanting to connect with something bigger than ourselves.
The power of language, how we communicate.
Exactly.
It's that constant search for meaning, figuring out why we're here.
And we want to share what you think about all this.
Yeah, definitely. Share your thoughts with us on social media, on the show's website.
This deep dive, well, it's really just the beginning.
Keep digging into these ideas.
Keep asking questions.
Keep trying to understand.
And most importantly,
share your own insights.
Because that's what makes this journey so incredible.
We're all learning from each other.
Expanding our perspectives, challenging what we think we know, maybe even learning something new about ourselves along the way.
Thanks for joining us for this exploration of, prophecy, speaking in tongues, and everything that comes with it.
Until next time, keep on diving deep.